All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone who has joined today's Tech Product Ethics event. The whole theme of our event today is really around who is responsible for creating ethical products. I'll take a second to introduce myself before I share what the agenda is today. My name is Danielle Panagal. I am the program manager here at the Experience Innovation Center, which I'll tell you a little bit more about after I share today's agenda. So looking at the lineup today, we're going to start with some opening remarks, hear a keynote, and then enter into a fireside chat. It'll take about 2 hours, and just so you all know, the event will be recorded and accessible on YouTube. So we'll send out a link after the event to you all so you have access to it. Really quickly, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, UEGroup. They are a leading full-service user experience and customer insights firm who helps companies and brands across the world humanize technology for more approachable experiences. So they help with the entire process from product strategy through to research, design, and all the way up to development and getting that product actually on market. So you can learn a little bit more about them at their website here, and we'll include links and everything following the event as well. A little bit about X Center, the Experience Innovation Center, and who we are. Our mission is really to bring together amazing minds to reinvent how tech gets done for humans. What that means to us is things like today, hosting events that allow collaboration and conversation between academia and industry for knowledge sharing, but also taking an inventive approach to user experience and innovation. Through training, education, workshops. We host things like co-invention workshops with product teams, and we regularly host events like this one and additional ones. So we are a national hub for UX and innovation, and we're located on Purdue University's campus. We really partner with students, faculty, and industry to rethink and reinvent how people and technology interact together. So that is a little bit about us, and there'll be some slides at the end where you can follow along and learn a little bit more. But I am going to hand it over to Tony Fernandes, who is going to give our opening remarks for today. Tony is the founder and CEO of the sponsor company, UEGroup. He's a usability expert with 25 years of experience in UX strategy, research, design, and he has founded some of the user experience groups at Netscape, as well as IBM and Xerox PARC. So Tony, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Danielle. So welcome to the inaugural X Center's inaugural Tech Product Ethics event. I'm very pleased to have UEGroup sponsor this event because I think it's a very timely and important topic that many of us should be discussing, especially those of us working in terms of digital products that impact people's lives. All of us would agree that terms like dark patterns, deep fakes, digital privacy have come into our regular vocabulary. And the ethical issues aren't unique to tech, but I think tech professionals have a unique responsibility because of the power and the reach of this type of technology. You know, the impact of some of the technology that we're unleashing is unpredictable in some ways. And we can all agree that we want society to benefit from our work, but it's not just a matter of doing the right thing. Making unethical decisions can also have a tremendously negative impact on business. So whether it's reputational or financial, for example, Facebook and its reputational damage related to how it uses data. Most recently, the trials related to Theranos and the impact of the fake it till you make it type of approach to putting technology products together, especially when it has a direct impact on people's health. By extension, VW and its doctored software in regard to emissions and the multi-billion-dollar payouts it had to put together to deal with that a problem. In terms of society, most recently, maybe within the last week, you may have heard that some people were accusing a video that President Biden made as being a deep fake. So the fact that that technology has been unleashed has now become part of the equation of how people assess whether what they're looking at is real or whether it's not. There have always been bad actors, there will always be bad actors, but in my experience, that isn't the origin of some of the issues that we deal with in tech in particular. In my experience, it comes from people wanting to know if a problem can be solved. And in the process, they ask the question of whether it can be created, and it doesn't get followed up with a question of whether it should be created. To me, that dilemma gets at the heart of why tech in particular has a tremendous responsibility to think about ethical issues. I'm super happy to have the speakers that we have today. My hope is that this discussion will create a collective feeling and knowledge that some of these issues can be tackled. And I wish everybody an amazing day of learning and of shaping thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for the intro. I need to reshare my screen here. Give me 1 second. I've lost the share button. So sorry. All right, there we go. All right, so now we are going to hand it over and get into the meat of today's event, starting with our keynote by Randy Fernando. Randy is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Humane Technology. They're a nonprofit that's all about helping to realign technology with humanity's best interests. So he's going to give us some insight on some ways to do that and how they're doing it and practices that we can involved in our daily work. And you may notice, you may recognize the name from their work featured in the film The Social Dilemma, which has been seen by over 100 million people globally. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Randy.
All right. Thank you very much, Danielle. And thanks, Tony, for the keynote, for the intro. Let me do a quick screen share here. Should work. All right. One moment. Sorry, just a moment. All right. Why does it keep doing this? Sorry, folks. We just did this a moment ago, but now it's not happy with me. Is that good? Wow. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, Zoom's being a little bit odd right now. Let me just do this. Okay, you can see now? Should be good. Yep, okay. Thank you, sorry. Zoom has some really weird things with Google Slides. So anyway, a little bit about Center for Humane Technology. As Daniel said, our goal is to realign technology with humanity's best interest. As we know, right, things have got quite divergent, especially lately. And so what we do is we explain what's going on, right? Because a lot of people don't understand exactly what is going on behind the scenes. And we explain how, from a systems point of view, what forces are actually driving technology and causing these problems. And then in the process, the idea is that we can then give people the capacity to actually make wiser choices, make some change. And we try to be very thoughtful about who we kind of influence, right? Because there are people who are well positioned in the system to make change, and our goal is to find them and change their minds. So our work is really at the center of systems thinking and tech design and existential risk, which is what happens when all of these systems come, they get out of control. Just a quick snapshot of the kinds of things that we offer, right? So of course, we're part of this film, we have a podcast, we have a course. I'll be talking a little bit about the course today as a central lens. It's a free course. We do a lot of media, we do briefings, a lot of work behind the scenes. We have a toolkit for youth, for those of you who care about like getting the younger generations to understand these problems well. We have a ledger of harms that explains, it sort of summarizes research in very understandable ways, very, very briefly, but links to the original papers. So if you want, you could get all the details. And we have a newsletter that summarizes key issues every 2 weeks or so. So a lot of interesting different ways you can get involved. So let me talk a little bit about kind of this mess we're in, and kind of Tony was alluding to, right? There's a wisdom gap between the mindset that we have and the mindset that we need to have when we're building technology, and that causes a lot of problems for us. So let me share a quick video. When future generations look back at the work of today's technologists, what will they see? Will they see products that helped us find meaning and balance, that helped us heal our communities and our democracies, and helped us find shared understanding? Or will they see clever hacks for maximizing engagement, algorithms that drove outrage, and a world where no one could tell fact from fiction? Today, we face massive global challenges, from worsening mental health to growing inequity, rising authoritarianism, and the climate crisis. One way or another, the technology we build will shape our collective capacity to solve those problems. Here at Center for Humane Technology, we believe that to build the technology that matters tomorrow, we have to start with different principles today. That's why we created Foundations of Humane Technology, an online course for people designing, developing, and distributing 21st century technology. Through course content, reflection questions, activities, external resources, and community events, you'll learn how to develop more humane technology that benefits society and aligns with your values. And you'll be doing so alongside thousands of technologists from around the world who are similarly concerned and eager to be of service. We have a momentous challenge in front of us, but it's one we must meet together. We hope you'll join us. Learn more at humanetech.com/course. Okay. So that just kind of gives some framing for how we think about our work and how it sort of sits with respect to the problems that the world has. I think there's a tendency to not take that step back and look at what the world really needs with respect to what we can offer. One of the things that really helps when we get to this kind of thinking is this quote from the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, who unfortunately passed away last year. He said some brilliant things, and one of them is this: right? We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And because these are out of sync, we run into a whole bunch of problems. So I'll walk you through some of the examples. And I think you're all very well aware of like what we can do now with synthetic imagery, right? So you can give a prompt like this and you can generate a beautiful image like that. There's so many new examples, right? DALL-E 2 is even better than DALL-E 1, and it just produces all kinds of interesting output for text inputs. And you can customize all of these. There's papers coming out every week about how you can morph the dog into a cat or a giraffe or whatever you want, anything that the algorithms have trained on. And now Google has Imagine, which does very similar things, also very high quality. And so in this world where we have these kinds of technologies and where we have the ability to do things like you can use that same technology to now generate fictitious information, right? Fictitious imagery. And then if you start to look at what you can also do with things like deepfakes, this is a great video. I'm not going to play it here, but there's a video of world leaders seeing John Lennon's Imagine, right? And they're all synced up, and it's really sweet and inspiring. And then you think about, of course, like what can be done, and just like Tony said in the keynote, in the intro, this idea that you can now deepfake world leaders. When that's done once, it creates doubt for every other clip that exists. And video really is one of the ways that we verify to each other, right, that something is true or not. So it's a big problem when you can cast doubt, because you only need to cast doubt on 1%, one time even, right, to have the effect of casting doubt on everything. And this is the big challenge. And then on top of that, right, we have the ability to create synthetic humans. So these are just 3D, these are not even, none of these humans exist, and they're entirely done with 3D modeling. And you can, in the MetaHuman Creator, you can adjust the hair, the freckles, the eyebrows, the eyes, every aspect, and you can, pull the nose out, pull the ears out, whatever you want. And you can create these humans, and you can sync them up with audio, and they'll talk. And then, of course, on top of all that, we have 3D images, 3D landscapes, all of this, which has existed for a long time. So amazing, amazing work. But imagine now, right? So we package those things inside our tweets and inside our shares. We don't have a lot of protections. And suddenly we have a neutron bomb for trust on the internet, right? It just explodes, the whole thing. And I expect, I don't want to be a harbinger of doom, right? But it's one of these things where we have to be realistic. These moves start to be very competitive and attractive for bad actors. And you will start to see more of these things happening over time. So the reason this all is so important, right, is that when we have difficult problems to solve, like the ones that we talked about in that video, right? You look at climate, you look at inequity, and you just look around at all of the different problems we have to solve. Not to mention things like genetic engineering, right? And like how we keep control of that. We have the ability to now create new chemicals, create new viruses. All of these things are possible. And so there's this cascading series of problems. And to solve those problems, we need to have two key faculties. One is what we call sense making, which is how we take all of the inputs out in the world and integrate them in our heads and kind of figure out what's true, what's not true, what's important to us and what's not important to us. And then there's the second aspect, which is choice making, right? How do we make wise choices? How do we make the choices that matter, that will help us get out of the problems that we're in? And increasingly, these two critical faculties are mediated by our technology, right? So this phone, ends up driving so much of our decision making and our attention and where we place our attention. And that has dire consequences. So the way we see it, I think it's hard to argue against it, is that extractive runaway technology is accelerating, right? It's accelerating our ability to respond to all of these crises. It's also accelerating the crises themselves, because in many cases, the technology is accelerating the ability to cause, right, different types of harm. Yeah, so I'm just looking at the chat to make sure I'm up to date. And so, okay, can I not go up? Okay. And so what's happening, right, is this technology is actually decreasing our ability to make sense of the complexity, right? And why is that? Because we end up in this situation, right? The current social media disaster situation where sense making is broken down, we're overloaded with information, right? We don't have we have the platforms are basically designed around this idea of infinite user generated content. And then all of that content is competing for attention. So instead of a situation we had before where we didn't have enough information, we couldn't figure out, we couldn't find facts. Now we have too many facts, too many opinions. We don't know who's qualified and who's not qualified. And so we're completely overloaded. Addiction, obviously, is a major problem that everyone knows about, right? A lot of these algorithms are taking advantage of the way our brain works to addict us. We have a culture of influencers where like that, and that's influencing not just the way we spend our attention, but the way our values are formed inside of us, right? And the way children's values are developed as they grow up. Polarization, right? Fake news. And not to mention how many of the accounts on platforms are bots. We don't even, it's easy to lose track of that. It's a massive percentage. It's hard to know exactly because of the reporting. But a few strategically placed bots can cause enormous rifts in the popular opinion on particular topics. So all of these things are happening at once, and those are downgrading our ability to respond. So the complexity of the world is increasing, but our wisdom and our response is not matching up. And this goes back to the E.O. Wilson quote. So more examples, right? So is fact-checking really the solution to misinformation? A lot of times the platforms love to frame it this way because it's convenient for them to keep the operating model that they have, which is basically like a flamethrower, right? Flamethrower in a forest. And they'll love to spend energy talking about what we can do to put out individual trees that are on fire. But they never want to talk about how do we turn the actual flamethrower down. And so we tend to be in the business of talking about how to turn the flamethrower off. So as an example, right? So fact-checking. You can take GPT-3 and give it a prompt, right? You can have it write the paper for you on why a vaccine wouldn't be safe, citing real facts and real stats, and include vested corporate interests, right? These are all facts these are all elements of truth that exist, even though the actual death rate from COVID-19 vaccines is like 0.0026% or something like that, right? It's somewhere, there might be an extra zero in there, but it's very small, it's very uncommon. But you can certainly find those cases and you can certainly amplify them. And if you have the right platform, you can make one case paired with a synthetically written research paper like this and make that into truth. Do we need to protect freedom of speech? Of course. But if we overemphasize freedom of speech, remember this world, right, where we can tweet out synthetic information, we can create synthetic information and then distribute it. In this world, free speech shouldn't be the primary lens that we look at. Obviously, we want to be, we don't want to suppress important, especially movements that need their voices to be heard. But we have to be cognizant of these trade-offs, right, as we go through the process. Protecting privacy. This is another one that comes up all the time. There was this app, right, that tricked 80 million people into uploading photos of themselves because it took advantage of our innate human vulnerability, right, for curiosity. It's human nature, and most of the time, curiosity serves us very well. But in this case, curiosity turned out to be disastrous, right? Because you end up uploading your information, which can then be analyzed and stored and then synthesized and deepfaked. So you can generate trustworthy faces on demand. All the faces here with S's are synthetic, the R's are real. It's really hard to tell the difference between them. So it brings us back to the situation, right? We have all of these problems, and they're accelerated by the social media landscape. So how do we address that? Right? This sounds like quite a mess, right? The extractive attention economy is, I hope you're convinced, even in this very short time, that we have some serious problems, and the effect on sense-making and choice-making are underlying our ability to respond to everything else. So when you have a system like this, how do you deal with it? We can look at different points of intervention. This is inspired by Donella Meadows' The 12 Leverage Points to Intervene in the System, which is an amazing essay, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't read it. And so you can look at these different leverage points, right, to make changes. And really what we are interested in is the paradigm, right? Like, what is the operating system? What is the mindset that generates all of the other actions that happen downstream? So when we build products, what are we thinking? What are the ideas that we hold to be true that drive our behavior and our decision making? And when we address that, all of the decisions we make, the conversations we have, all of those will fall into line if we can address the paradigm. So this is why we spend a lot of effort on that. Obviously, you need all of them, right? And I'll talk a little more about that and how we combine the different efforts to advance change. So we went from this extractive paradigm, right? These are the most common kinds of things you would hear, right? We're just giving people what they want. Every tech has its goods and bads. We need to maximize personalization. Technology is neutral. Who are we to choose? We've got to focus on engagement and getting those metrics up. And we need to think differently, right? We need to respect human nature, minimize harmful externalities, create shared understanding, support fairness and justice, center values, and actually focus on thriving and what does thriving actually mean. So if we replace this extractive set on the left with this humane set on the right, we will do a lot better. So today what I'm going to do, so our course, right, this course called Foundations of Humane Technology goes through all of these principles. And so what I'm going to do today is to walk through very quick highlights of each of them and just talk about a few interesting points, food for thought. And hopefully that will encourage you to dive into the course more deeply, because I think if you're here and you find these points interesting, I think you really enjoy the course and it will serve you well in the kinds of thinking and decision-making that we need to have. So let's talk about the principles. The first one is this idea of respecting human nature, right? Instead of exploiting our innate psychological vulnerabilities. And to understand that better, let's look at this experiment, which many of you may have seen. Which square is darker, A or B? And just pause for a moment and just take a look at it. Of course, the answer, as you probably know, both are the same, right? And you only see that if you really bring these lines through, and you draw these lines through, you can see they're the same. But the interesting thing is, even if you know this, so now I've told you, right? Let's look at it again. Wow, that's hard. It's hard to see, right? I have a master's degree in computer science, and specifically I worked on shadows from a master's thesis, and it does me no good here, right? No matter how much you've looked at these things, and I can understand exactly why, and the perceptual kind of the cognitive help that your brain is trying to give that causes this problem. But the key point here is as interesting as this is, the key point is, even if you know how it works, you will still get tricked. And this is why these same biases that show up in social media are a real problem, right? They're not just visual, they end up socially, right? So the fact that we are going to compare ourselves to others, the fact that we have recency bias, the fact that more recent things will stick in our brain more than others. And same thing with, we're attracted to fats and sugars, right, in the food we eat. All these things are meant to help us survive. They're meant to help us mainly to reproduce, right? And so it's sort of like, that's where these biases have served us very well in the past, but they don't necessarily serve us as well in the world we live in now. And the problem is when our technology takes advantage of them. So here, a lot of the time we've been worried about when technology overwhelms our human strengths, when it takes our jobs and our creativity. And to be honest, we are there also, right? So we are in that world where a lot of our creativity, things that like art, poetry, writing, music, all of these are increasingly being taken. Computers can do them very, very well. But there's this other really dangerous aspect that doesn't get talked about as much, which has led to our current predicament, which is when technology overwhelms our weaknesses, right? Our cognitive biases, the fact that we get addicted easily. It's very easy to hijack our attention, to control what we look at, what we pay attention to. All of these things are so easy to control. And when technology does that, we end up in this social media mess that we're in right now, where we are addicted, polarized, and basically downgraded as humans. So quick highlights of how we summarize this module is it's easy to exploit our evolutionary tendencies. A lot of times, what platforms and many technologists like to say is, we're just giving people what they want. And without recognizing that they're not respecting human nature in that process. So what happens when we're giving people what they want, a lot of times we're actually abdicating the moral responsibility for exploiting human desire. And all of this doesn't end up making people happy in the long term. It ends up driving them into these other realms that are unskillful, and they tend to regret deeply later on. So instead, what we have to do is to look at what are the values and intentions that people have, and what do they really want to live by, and how can we help them do that? So we'll talk more about that. Another example I want to point out is it's not just about hijacking human nature, right? Or, in the negative aspects, but there's also these beautiful things about humans, right? That, as an example, if we are solving a difficult problem and we're doing it here, face to face, right? Something like this kind of environment that's conducive, and we're able to talk and we're able to look and use our mirror neurons to see another person's expression, empathize. A lot happens magically, right? The same cognitive biases help us there because we are primed for social interaction. We're primed for building community because that's actually how we survive better. So this is a great example of how we really want to tap into these positive aspects of human nature. The next principle is this idea of minimizing harmful consequences instead of evading responsibility for the harms of technology. So one of the big problems, right, this idea of externalities, these are aspects that don't show up on the balance sheet, right? So classical economics, right, has supply and demand, you've got price in the middle, and everything that can't be captured by and we talk a lot about, right, moving the supply curve and the demand curve, and anything that's not captured by this simple model is an externality, right? These are like outside aspects. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And one of the big ones that gets put aside as an externality is the earth, right? The earth itself, the ecology, living beings, relationships, all of these things, because they're hard to measure, they end up being a side project, right? And we sort of come back to that later and say, oh gosh, like how do we price that back in? We need to have penalties, carbon credits, right? We need to penalize people for pollution, as an example. And when we do that, we end up destroying the foundations that our technologies and our own lives are built upon. And now we're doing that to the planet, right? This is sort of the ultimate version where we are actually destroying the very planet that we live on. And of course, having, I think it's like 3 or 6 trillion, right? Air conditioners, and there's kind of the same number of cows. There's like 6 trillion cows. All of these things, when they exist at this kind of volume, right? And we're harvesting and farming and multiplying, right? And cars, same thing. They're all about the same magnitudes. There's an effect on the environment, and it's pretty bad, right? And now technology helps us accelerate the production of all of those things. And so when you take extraction and competition, which are sort of how our economic system works, and you accelerate that with technology, we are now at the point where we are incurring existential risks and starting to have the scale of problems that are going to be a threat to humanity itself. So this idea of growth at all costs, that we just can't keep perpetuating this. It's not going to work. And so we have to figure out how to have more regenerative systems. I won't go into detail here, but it's in the course. But one simple practical thing is the idea of matching KPIs, right? This idea of what do we measure, right? Key performance indicators. Generally, when these go up, our product is doing well. We should also have anti-KPIs, right? Things that measure failure. So for example, we could pair engagement, right? Time spent on our platform, which may be good to some, at some level it's going up is good, and at some level it starts to get really bad. How do we know? Maybe we measure something else. We have an anti-KPI, which is something like mental health complaints. So when those rise up, we know that we've reached, right? We start to reach the limits of the KPI being good. And it's important to reflect on some of the common paradigms that got us here, right? Growth is good. You can own land, right? These are just these ideas that are deeply entrenched. So we talked about how paradigms are like the fundamental operating system of our brain. These kinds of ideas are in all of our brains, right? If we've been around in Western societies, and they lead to these kind of harmful situations. So being aware of that and seeing which ones of these we can change, obviously some are easier than others. In some cases, like this idea of people are perfectly rational economic actors, just being aware that our economics are built on that broken assumption helps us to make better assumptions and better choices. So then there's this idea of multipolar traps, right? So we get in this mess where capitalism relies on regulation to make fair rules for companies, right? That's the idea. And so that's supposed to tame our technology. But going back to the E.O. Wilson quote, our institutions can't keep up with our technology. That's our problem. So the idea that within these rules, companies would compete to serve citizens in a positive way, right? That should work really well. That's when capitalism is actually functioning well. When the rules lag our tech, companies end up competing to exploit citizens because there's so many ways to take advantage, right, of our minds, of the ways that you can compete in the marketplace to exploit us. And it also has downstream consequences for the planet and externalities. And so we're seeing this everywhere, right? Not just in social media, but also fast food, pharmaceuticals, travel, whatever you want. I mean, it's happening everywhere. And where it's happening worse is industries that are closest to these kinds of technologies that are very hard to understand and regulate. They're hard to understand the consequences of. So you end up with these what are called multipolar traps, where everyone is competing with each other and you end up in a race to the bottom. And it's easy to forget this also happens on a global stage. So you end up with democratic states that are trying to have these kind of open economies with more freedom, and it's much harder to regulate in those environments. And you end up competing against more authoritarian states that actually, if they understand these problems, they can lock them down much sooner. And China is an example where they've done this very effectively to protect their own citizens and their ability as a nation to be competitive. So we have to be aware of all of this. We can't take a lens that's like only in the US or only in the EU or something like that when we think about how to solve these problems. So we go from this world on the left to the world on the right, and this is happening at scale. It's terrible. So how do you tame a situation like this? Well, this is kind of complex, but I'll just roughly say you have to use a bunch of different forces to internalize the costs, right? These externalities, the problem with them is those are costs that are borne by other people, other systems. So how do we make those costs, how do we bring those costs inside the system to the people who are actually generating the harms? And so you do that through external pressure, right? Cultural awakening, you teach people. So if you get lucky and you have a film that reaches a large number of people, that does the kind of education where consumer behavior can shift. So you have to do education, you have to do media, policy, right? Legislation and litigation are both ways of making the costs internal. Concerned insiders have leverage in this conversation. And then you can inspire, right, new ways of doing things that actually make the cost of doing the right thing lower while you're penalizing the cost of doing the wrong thing. And when you put all that together, this is how you can change the way products are built. This particular diagram is for tech, right, for social media in particular, but you can get the idea that this is how you would address many other systems as well. So let's talk quickly about values. This idea of abdicating responsibility by claiming that technology is neutral. One of the key things I really want you to take away from this talk is that technology is not neutral. It never can be. Humans can't be neutral, and really nothing is, because everything is conditioned by other things. Even rocks, right? Everything is conditioned by other things. That interdependence is just a fact of life. And so the problem is when we don't understand that, of course, we're conditioned by the people who raised us, right? Our friends, our family, our teachers, the culture we grew up in, the paradigms that culture is built on. All of this, right? The kinds of people we've interacted with, like what we look like. All of that is part of what's baked into our head. And those values are baked into what we build. And so we have to understand that those conditions shape our technology. And so we have to be very clear, right, about, there's this conversation also about, okay, once we know that, we have to commit to what are our values. We have to be clear about values as distinct from goals, for example, right? Values are not endpoints. They are principles that guide us continuously. And yes, we pair them with metrics, but we are committed to the values. So what we say is we want to be metrics informed, but values driven. We can't let metrics become our values. And too often that is exactly what happens. So this diagram kind of shows, right, how it all happens, right, where humans have our incentives and our values and our own biases. That ends up shaping technology, which shapes society, right? Especially machine learning algorithms that actually, they have a feedback loop, right? So they learn from the data around them. And so they can actually end up amplifying these effects even more. And I talked through a bunch of these, but this diagram, I think, helps to make it clear. Shared understanding. So we talked about this, right? This idea of customizing realities, right? Which often is paired with micro-targeting, right? The idea of customizing is about keeping us on site more, but also about targeting, figuring out and making us more and more the kind of person that can be targeted specifically, because that's very monetizable. And of course, then our attention is sold, and we all know this part of the puzzle. So if we want to fix shared understanding, we have to understand all of the different mechanisms. How does it break down? And so we talked through all of this in the course, the different types of distortions that social media builds. And then we have to talk about systemic ways to address the harms at their source. I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. And the last thing is we have to remember that the harmful conditioning of our minds doesn't end, right? Like, just because, even if you fix everything, you fix all the social media and you fix all the fires and you turn the flamethrower off, the values, the habits, right? Especially for kids, all the damage that's been done still continues. The mind has to be, there's a whole training process, right? Retraining, untraining process that has to happen to get us out of this mindset, take all those bad habits and change them back into better habits. So just a reminder here, right, about the importance of sense making and choice making. This is the lens that I think we want to emphasize, because most of the time conversations at platforms, they don't talk about this, right? This is not a key aspect. It's much more about harms, right? Looking at the harms that are at the edges and not looking at the source here and saying, okay, are we helping people make good sense of the world and make good choices? You can imagine a scenario like this, right, where our tech actually helps us hold multiple valid viewpoints at once. This is an example for COVID, where there's a certain level of seriousness you should take it at. Obviously, things are different now. We have much more mitigating measures. We have to be careful about government overreaches, right, in the process, and not just government, but also companies, right, because it's very profitable. There's all these incentives. There's economic devastation that comes when we have to close, and we have to be really conservative and careful. And at the same time, it highlights, right, racial injustice, structural injustices that show up in communities. All of these things can be true at the same time. Often the percentages aren't the same. And this is another piece, right? So we have this problem of unrepresentative amplification of individual anecdotes. So these are the kinds of conversations that really don't come up that much, that we need to have much more often. Also, ways to build shared understanding, right? So these are more systemic ones. Reducing viral friction. If you make sure that information can't spread too easily, that helps a lot. This is more systemic. They're not at the very, very root, but they're closer. More small peak winners instead of giant peaks, right? Where like this one video goes super viral. Let's let more voices have a stake, and then we don't have to all perform like we need to win the lottery, right? That has better outcomes for everybody. I'll skip perception gaps in the interest of time, but there's a lot of these things, again, in the course we talk about. Intimate conversations, right? The idea of giving people a safer space to have conversations instead of trying to broadcast in front of all your friends. Like, you don't want to broadcast in front of thousands of people when you're trying to solve difficult problems, right? So that's another way to de-escalate, for example. Fairness and justice. A lot of the time, our technology ends up widening gaps of inequity. And why is that? Because of how early adoptions work and where the money is. And so you sort of chase that. And we need to go back to first principles and think about, what do we actually want for our society, right? We want citizens should have the opportunity to experience democratic values in practice, not just in principle, right? Like we just, not by what we say we aspire to, but by what we actually achieve. And a lot of times technology, that lens is just missing, right, from technology. On top of that, technologists have very limited experiences. We talked about this earlier. And that equips them quite poorly to serve others at a massive scale. So when our products are in populations that we know well, or we have an intuition for, that's great. When they become global, we start to have these problems, right, where we don't understand the different cultures and the different aspects. And that happens even within countries, but that happens even more so globally. And what we need to do is to figure out how to be in relationship with the populations that we serve, right? Instead of the idea that technologists are just going to solve problems. We're going to solve difficult problems. And there's a real ego exploration to have here, right? Because a lot of these problems happen because of our own egos, and wanting to, it's like the savior complex problem, right? And just either wanting to be helpful, which can be a trap in itself, and oftentimes tied with financial incentives, of course, right? And this is where the models of returns, the models of investment structures have a big role to play in whether technology is humane or not. And the last one is about thriving. I mean, this is the point. This is why we do everything we do, right? Is the idea that we want to thrive. And the problem is most of us haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what does that really mean? What is happiness really? And it's always evolving, right? It's not one of these things that we get to thriving and then we're done. It's more of a consistent way of being than a state. And a lot of it is really about, what is our relationship to life? What is our relationship to pleasure, pain, meaning, purpose, right? These kinds of questions. And related to that is, what is the narrative? This is a really key thing. What is the story we are telling in our head? What's the narrative? And specifically, what elements of that narrative involve me and I, and how much does it revolve around myself? we need to have awareness, right? The ability to see more clearly without just having a story that's centered around ourselves. We need to cultivate mindfulness, right? Instead of being compulsive and addicted, self-deception can happen very easily. Distraction can happen very easily with our technology. So we talk a lot about this. Is kind of a very deep topic, hard to go into detail very quickly. But the last thing is we also have to align, right? Thriving is not just about one mind. It's about the needs of others, about community and relationships, and the earth itself and the flora and fauna around us. So one simple example is looking back at apps that we use and saying, do we cherish the time or regret the time? And a lot of the time, right, when we look back, we have a very clear picture of what was wise or unwise. In fact, you can use regret in many ways, it serves as a helpful proxy for wisdom. If you're looking for like a quick proxy. And then the last thing is this idea of the big picture, right? So donut economics, which Kate Rayworth invented, and we did a podcast episode with her, which I highly recommend. Our podcast is called Your Undivided Attention, and I suggest you check it out. Super fascinating, right? This idea of, she talks eloquently about how price is in the middle as a first principle, right, in our economic theory, and how that leads to a big mess, and how we want to have this system that's much more balanced, where there are minimums we don't want to fall under, but also when we exceed, we deplete our resources in ways that are unsustainable. So just want to bring this idea in. In the course, we also talk about, alternatives to GDP. We have all these resources for you, depending on what you're interested in, to go learn. So yeah, check it out. I highly recommend it. Lots of people from tech platforms, startups, NGOs, universities, and more. It's very strategic to have more people in the world thinking along these lines, especially people who are well positioned with respect to building technology. That's why we built it, and that's why I'm here talking about it and inviting you to check it out as well. So that's it. Happy to take questions. Let me stop the screen share. All right. Thanks all.
I am muted. So we have a question here.
Yes.
And you talked about the humane paradigm, and can that align with businesses' goals? A lot of times those goals are financial. Do you see a world where they are motivated to start to align with that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think this is why we kind of went back to that diagram, right? With the the rainbow, we call it the rainbow diagram because it's got all the colors. No one's going to make the move just from like an ethical standpoint, right? It's not likely. So you have to use these other forces also. You have to kind of put it all together to make the changes happen. And when you have to make it, unfortunately, right? So much is revolving around our economics, right? And around money, right? The incentives, most of the time, incentives trump ideals. It sucks, but that's how it is, right? And so because of that, we have to look at the incentive structures and say, what can we do to influence the incentives? And that's why that diagram is useful. When you take, like, as one example, right? If you have a business model that generates a long tail of different harms, right? Say to kids, to sense making, or whatever, you can just list off these harms. Each of those harms has a price, right? There's a cost. And for example, when children self-harm, right, or there's suicide, there's an infinite cost, right? And those are the worst cases. And so you have to find ways to bring those costs back. And often that'll be through a lawsuit or through a new law, right, that penalizes. And new laws allow litigation to happen. That then brings those costs back into the companies. As an example.
Thank you. We have another one here, kind of along the lines of, even in that question, your answers, all of the forces are what's gonna kind of spark that change. As individuals, what would you say are the things, either as someone consuming products or I guess, and someone who's designing them, what are like the tangible things that we can be doing to help that?
Leverage is different, right? Depending on who you are. And I think one of the things we have to be very honest about is there's not a realistic scenario where like consumer pressure on its own is going to make much change, because even the social dilemma, which reached 100 million people, and I'll bet like maybe hundreds of thousands of people actually left social media, their accounts, as a result. But the network effects are very strong and they come back, right? And so it's sort of like, that's part of why it's so hard to solve this particular problem. And this is why we focus so much on people who have power inside the system in various positions. Some are inside the companies building products, but also like policymakers or tech policy experts. All of these are, the media, right? The way the media portrays problems, all of these affect how we can fix the problems.
Thank you. Are there?
We can take one more, I guess, right?
Yeah. One more. Are you able to see it?
Oh, yeah, the role of religion in tech values. That's a great question. What I would say is what's the role of values as a whole, and where do values come from, right? And I think traditionally values have come from religion, right? Religion is one of the healthiest places that has taught people kind of the basics, like the basic layer that is really shared across people, basic morality, basic ethics, that all the religions they have a lot of commonality across those. So I think that is one thing that we are missing, is we've come to a more secularized world, but we've left behind some of the conversations around ethics and basic moral agreements. Like agreeing that we're not going to lie to each other should not be rocket science, right? But of course, that sounds simple, but then when you pair that with the deep fake world, you have a problem, right? Because a lot of the people who are sort of like spreading misinformation or disinformation, they don't think they are. They don't think they're lying. They feel strongly about what they're sharing. That's the problem, right? So it's sort of like they're actually being ethically or morally very strong. They feel like they're trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to protect something that they believe in. And so I think this is a complex discussion, but I think religion, or rather like the layer above all of these things, above the economic incentives, like what's the layer above capitalism or economic systems? It's values. So can we have more conversations there? And that feels like a very relevant lens for today's conversation.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any other questions that we can answer live right now?
Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Well, thank
everybody.
you so much,
Thanks
Randy,
for
for your
your
time, and we'll be sure to share the links to the course as well, so that everyone can sign up and dive even deeper.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Alrighty, so next we are going to head into our fireside chat portion. I'm going to do a quick introduction of the three folks who will be joining this conversation, and then I'll let them intro if there's anything else that they'd like to mention once we hand it over to them. So our moderator today is Doug Rapp. He is a cybersecurity catalyst, and he's the VP of Training and Education at the NineTwelve Institute. They work at the convergence of industry, academia, and government with emerging technologies. He's also pursuing a PhD in information security policy and ethics at Purdue University, which is a great segue into one of our participants, Dr. Lindsay Weinberg. She is a clinical professor at Purdue University, and she is the founding director of the Tech Justice Lab. So her research and her teachings are at the intersection of science and technology studies, as well as media and feminist studies, specifically focusing on the social and ethical impacts of digital technology itself. And finally, from an industry representative today is going to be Bryan Langley. He is the co-founder of Blackthorn Cognitive. This company is dedicated to warding against malign influence, and he is the leading senior executive in defense development, and homeland security, helping organizations and governments alike develop the ability to prepare for events with cognitive and cyber impacts. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the Fireside Chat participants. I think you guys might, oh yeah.
The most uttered words of I think the last 2 years are sorry I was on mute. So hey, thank you, Danielle, for the intro, and thank you, Tony and the user experience group for hosting this this online event. And then Randy, obviously, thank you for your great keynote speech and the work that you're doing at the Center for Humane Technology. Bryan seems to be having a little bit of technological problems, but he can join us in progress. We proved last night during rehearsing for this that we have no problem talking about this subject that we're all very passionate about, and it's a pleasure to share this virtual stage with Dr. Weinberg and Bryan, Langley, and Randy, and the rest of the UEG crew. So Lindsay, we'll just kind of dive right in. We've heard what Randy had to say about the effects of ethics and products, and as we look at these effects that permeate our society now more than ever, and doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. So it begs the first question: that who is responsible for the ethical design process? I mean, when we look at these products that are coming to market, whether it's social media products or tools and apps or services, where do we begin with this? Who's responsible for it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas. I just want to quickly thank you for moderating. I want to give a shout out to Danielle Panigal and Halle Berry for all their work organizing, and I'm honored to be here. So thanks to the UEGroup for even inviting me. To your question about, how do we locate responsibility in terms of, who should be responsible for ethics when we're talking about product development? I think it's everybody, right? I think it's, of course, folks who have power over how these tools are conceived and how decisions are being made about the kinds of impacts they're going to have in the world. But I think there also needs to be more of an integration of marginalized people, everyday people who are oftentimes the most disparately impacted and yet the farthest removed from the design processes. And I also think we need, of course, regulation and some kind of barriers put in place about what's permitted and what's allowed to enforce democratic accountability and make it possible to make sure that everyone's values are being included, as opposed to, what's most expeditious for making profits. So I guess I think everybody has a hand in this, right? And I think the question is, how do we democratize these conversations and these decision-making powers so that folks feel like they're actually represented in how and what gets built?
Yeah, that's a great question. From the business perspective, there are certain advantages to getting to market quicker than the next person. So as we race towards releasing things on the market, it seems very often that the considerations for the negative effects, whether it's through a risk assessment or just through contemplation during the design process, it kind of goes by the wayside because time is money. So but that really leaves it to the product designer at that point, who is that person who's sitting there coding, or creating the product, designing the product, to make ethical decisions, and include their own ethical biases, their own biases and prejudice into the things that they're building, without any check or balance system there. I love the aspect, you mentioned about the user. The role of the user, we have all these ratings and feedbacks and how am I doing, things like that, but they don't seem really oriented at, how do we make the product more humane or better in that aspect, just used for more efficiency. So I've done a little bit of work in this area. Most of my work is around ethical frameworks during the design process, and values as security. And throughout my research, I've really tried to take a look at what regulations are out there from a bigger governance perspective. What are you seeing in this area in regulations and governance?
I think though the ones that I'm most familiar with are coming out of privacy law. So efforts to really either curtail or constrain how data is being collected and what it's being used for. But I think what we see dominant trends in regulation around privacy are just making sure that there's notice and consent policies that are accurate, right? And I think that that's a very limited framework for trying to think about how to make sure there's consent and accountability. A lot of users might agree to terms of service. They might not have the 60 days it would require or the legal competency it would require to actually wade through those services, let alone feel like they can even not consent, right? If it's a service you have to use or a product that's going to allow you to collect with your family overseas for free, right? That's where that kind of hegemonic pressure comes in to force people to consent to things that are actually extractive and exploitative because they don't feel like they have alternatives. So I think that there's body of laws that exist, right? The question I think is whether or not they're truly protective of privacy. And then I think, of course, there's all kinds of efforts that are happening at the local right now. Like we're seeing city ordinances get passed against facial recognition technology in parts of California. So I think there's certainly a lot of effort and agitation to get stricter regulations or bans on some of this tech. But unfortunately, it's still largely piecemeal and certainly an uphill battle.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that from what I've seen. Even in privacy, we're on the verge, unless we come up with something similar to GDPR, from Great Britain, from the UK, unless we come up with something holistic like that, we're going to end up with about 50 different versions of privacy laws, which is going to be very interesting and challenging for tech, for big tech for sure. But I agree, it's what we're seeing now is fairly piecemeal, and it usually arises after there's some catalyst that brings it to the attention of people, and then they are able to rally behind it, particularly like the facial recognition and all the flaws that have taken place with that. But as we see the acceleration of technology, we have gone from cutting and pasting people's faces onto other people's bodies in pictures to a point in deepfakes now where humankind cannot tell the difference between some deep fakes and reality. So we've done that, and particularly in deep fakes, what you said as an example, that's been over a period of maybe 3 to 4 years that it's accelerated that quickly, particularly with the proliferation of AI. So how in the world are regulations supposed to keep up with the speed of innovation out there?
I think it's definitely a difficult task, but I think you'd be surprised about how many grassroots organizations and people who've been impacted by these sorts of innovations have been sounding the alarm. And I think the question is more about, like, are we listening to the right people, and are we creating the spaces where those kinds of concerns and harms are being attended to? So I don't know. I think there's a lot of effort and a lot of willingness to see change happen. I actually think that it's institutions that by design aren't allowing for these changes to really work, because it fundamentally undermines, very deeply entrenched capitalist principles that have organized a large part of our society. So I think it's more about, can we identify those barriers that are baked in, and can we make sure we're giving power and support to the folks already doing really necessary agitation on the ground?
Yeah, I agree. It would be interesting to see, particularly with organizations like Randy's, Center for Humane Technology. It would be interesting to see, how prolific those types of organizations, how powerful they are in the near future. So hopefully we'll keep trending in that direction. So when we look at the folks that are out there actually in the industry that are creating products, so they're out there, the coders, the engineers, the project managers, those folks, and even to some extent the leadership, higher education, they were educated somewhere. right? So in those institutions, I think up until now, there hasn't been a focus on building ethics or really understanding the implications of the technology that you have there. So what is the role of education in this? You yourself are a professor here at the Honors College at Purdue. What do you see as the role in higher ed in ensuring that folks that are out creating this new technology are grounded ethically and making things that contribute to better lives?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is, of course, really dear to me, and something that I try and do in my classes, and a number of my colleagues on our campus are trying to do this work as well. Like, what does it mean to center ethics as a part of what it means to be a designer or an engineer or a technologist, as opposed to, a one credit experience that you may tack on at the end of your 4th year. And I think that's the current existing curricula is by design, right? I don't think it's an unintentional overlaps that ethics is not foundational to STEM education, right? I think that that's a choice, and something that's kind of baked into what's deeply problematic about many STEM fields, right? These are also fields that have systematically pushed out women and folks of color from their ranks, both at issues with recruiting these folks, issues with retaining these folks, gaps in mentorship, gaps in support. Oftentimes, the technological competency is abstracted from the larger historical and social context. It's treated as something that's neutral and objective, even though we know it's not. So I'd also make an argument for more interdisciplinary education. If you're teaching a course that's teaching someone how to build a tool, they should also understand the historical and social context that tool is going to be applied within, and the lived experiences of people who are going to be impacted by it. So I think, yeah, classrooms need to be diversified, both at the level of curricula and whose lived experiences are in part of those classroom environments. And I think this is a big issue that I really hope we change soon.
Yeah, Randy had said, made a comment in there about the long-lasting effects, and I wish Bryan was on here because they work a lot in, Bryan and his company work a lot in cognitive defense. So whereas, I think you are on the education side and raising awareness there, my mission is to create tools that can be used during the process of design so that products become more ethical. But, Bryan and his colleagues deal with, misinformation campaigns and those psychological and emotional effects on people. So in saying that, so we look at, Randy made a comment that, a lot of damage has already been done. So from that aspect, what do we do about the designers, the product designers out there that are already out in the field and, have missed that opportunity to get, input about creating humane technology or ethical products?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's never too late, right? Like, it's never too late once you're aware that there's an issue or aware that there's like all kinds of folks trying to do this work on the ground to figure out ways to be in solidarity with those communities, to get yourself educated, to start watching documentaries and reading scholarship that's been talking about these challenges for decades now. So I would encourage those folks who are really keen to really start putting their ear to the ground and listening to people who've been talking about this stuff for a lot of years. I also think you need to organize your workplaces, right? It's really hard to be the one whistleblower who stands up against all the odds to raise alarm bells. But if you're in a workplace environment where you have colleagues that can support you or ways of voicing concerns that don't make you so precarious, those are places where we see a lot of transformation happening. Google is actually a really good example of this. You have workers that have walked out together in solidarity against sexual harassment at that company. You've had workers who refused to participate in Project Maven, which was kind of a military AI tool that was being developed by Google. So you can actually see, like, when there's collective efforts that happen in these workplaces, like, a lot of change can happen. That being said, I think it's a problem that so much power is currently located in the hands of technologists themselves. So I'd also be interested to see more large-scale transformations of how can we take that power and democratize it so that that one individual doesn't have so much of a say over the shape of technology in our society.
Yeah, it's just one point on that is you know, I remember as I came up with technology, and I'm a technology convert, you know, so I'm a digital convert. I'm not a native. I wasn't born with a computer like you know, everybody from the next generation onward. But it was interesting because, you know, the big tech companies were the liberal bastions of protecting values, you know, the idealistic values, and now we find out that they have kind of turned into the data barons of today versus the old railroad barons. But it's one thing I always do when I speak or have an opportunity to host a panel is you know, point people towards tools or things that they can use immediately, that they can add value to their life, because at the end of the day, we're talking heads on here for an hour, you know, and if it resonates with somebody, what's the next step for them? So, and then I'm also going to make a plug for, you know, the Great Hack, Social Dilemma, and one of my favorites, Imagine a Scientist. So what would you recommend that people can do to educate themselves and take this into the workplace?
Yeah, there's such good literature out there. One group that I'm a huge fan of is called the Design Justice Network. So they have kind of published principles. They talk about, you know, how exactly they partner with marginalized communities to think about what type of technology should I be building? Should I be building this thing at all? How do I center oppressed peoples in the work that I'm doing as a designer or a technologist? I think they're really great. Design Beku is in India doing similar type of work. There's Our Data Bodies, which I think is located in New York. Those are kind of a scholar activist collective that's really thinking about what are the database implications of our tools and how are they impacting marginalized people. So I think the work is out there, right? The scholarship is out there. There's excellent books for the Purdue folks in particular. Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks is fantastic. There's a whole chapter about the automation of welfare in Indiana and what happens when you kind of use private companies to automate public services and all of the harms and trade-offs that happen there. So I think, you know, and take classes, right? If you're a student, you know, even though it might maybe slow your graduation, you know, take classes in these courses or organize and push for your departments to make ethics part of your curriculum, right? Like I think organizing is something that can happen now. It's something that doesn't have to be a long-term prospect. And there's lots of folks already doing this work to get involved with.
Great. Those are great resources. Absolutely. So we talk about ethics. You know, we've talked a little bit about product ethics, you know, things specific to the product development, tech in general. So social media and those, or tech in general, you know, the ethics of the bottom line, and then media ethics. How do they compare to each other in design, and how do we begin and set and regulate ethical standards for each of those, or are they really kind of all the same thing?
I think they're deeply linked, but I'm curious what you think about this, Doug, especially if we don't have Bryan on the line. I'd love to get your voice more in the mix.
Yeah, you know, from that perspective, you know, I think obviously I'm focused at the very applied side. So I've always been an applied person. So when we look at product ethics, you know, I think of the type of work that I'm really interested in doing, which is creating tools and frameworks that can be implemented as part of the design process, as part of DevOps. You know, for me, tech ethics is another thing. You know, I look at, you know, the medical research. And medical research has a self-governing body that kind of keeps people in check. You know, so when you're doing genetic research, you know, you submit to you know, self-governance, and there are boundaries there. You know, even CRISPR technology is a great example. You know, amazing conversations going on right now about whether or not to modify mosquitoes in Africa. You know, because it'll save hundreds of thousands of lives. But we just don't know what the intended consequence, or your favorite phrase, unintended consequences are going to be, you know, a generation down the road, how that's going to affect the ecosystem. So I see a very broad, problematic absence of and any governance or self-governance within the tech industry there. And And then media ethics is you know, kind of has come along with media effects, and as the study of media effects has grown and really incorporated this explosion of social media and new platforms which we communicate on, you know, we're seeing huge impacts, whether it's in you know, political manipulation, you know, Cambridge Analytica, who most people find, you know from the Trump campaign, but really know little about the unethical experimentation that they did in Africa, about their organization of Brexit and these other things. So you know, the power of media has always been there, right? We've always had propaganda. We've always militarized information. But you know, I really see these as these three areas as probably the three big obstacles that we should look at tackling first. And I find them as being very distinct in that aspect. I mean, ethics and values is at the center of it, but they are, for me, they're distinct problems.
There's two things that you said that really resonated with me. The first was your point about how like these problems have always existed, right? It's not like we suddenly have digital technology and all of a sudden, you know, there's no faith in our democratic institutions, for instance, right? So some of these problems I think are intensifications of longstanding problems that we have in the US in particular, right? When we think about the effects of Cambridge Analytica on an election, well, we were already dealing with tremendous amounts of voter suppression, gerrymandering, right? Already tons of kind of discord and lack of access to rights. Now what happens when you kind of add new digital technological components to those issues? I just think it's a much more rigorous framing that allows us to talk about how deeply structural and systemic some of these problems are. And I also appreciated you thinking about, you know, what might it mean to draw influence from what's happening in medicine, right? And the kind of regulatory frameworks that they have there. I was immediately reminded of the IRB, right? At universities, that's what we use to kind of have our studies approved. And yet there's so much scholarship out there that looks at studies that technically meet the threshold of what IRB would consider an ethical study, and which nonetheless can be deeply ethically fraught. One example that immediately comes to mind, because it's about privacy, was the use of these long-range surveillance cameras to take pictures of students walking between classes without their knowledge or consent to train facial recognition technology. And this was a study that was approved by the IRB because it's students who are outside, so they don't have a quote unquote reasonable expectation of privacy. And nonetheless, their faces became part of data sets that were then published online, downloaded all over the world, commissioned by US federal government officials. You know, so I think it's, on the one hand, I totally support and want to think about how can we pull from existing frameworks, and yet how can we also embrace the critiques of those existing frameworks as well, so we make sure what we offer is more rigorous and really gets the job done.
What do you think, Bryan? Welcome, Bryan. Sorry put you on the spot there. No, understandable. Technology is our friend, right? So welcome to the conversation, Bryan. We're just going through and talking about the differences between product ethics, tech ethics, and media ethics, and how they compare to each other. So but we'll move on from that question to the next one. You know, how does the traditional design process need to adapt to take ethics into consideration? Where in the process does it fit? So as we look at product design specifically, you know, where in that process does it fit?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you want me to step in on that one, given my role, again, my apologies for running late. From the Homeland Security emergency management perspective, there's a lot part of how you are funding a project and who's it being funded by is a critical start for us to assess, you know, what is the lines that you're operating in and what's the initial intent of the product. For instance, you know, drones. For instance, any kind of emergency apparatus like the cloud that will allow people to communicate more effectively amongst each other, but at the same time, the adversary, the bad guy, may be looking at this in alternative means. So what we've really had to focusing on is the initial concept of who is funding this and why. And obviously with the federal government, like for instance, DoD has adopted ethical guidelines some time ago. So that's been kind of, I think, a helpful start for us when it comes to AI in one respect. But in addition to that, sister agencies or state agencies also were looking at ways in which we can kind of from product start asking the questions ethically, what are we going to do with this and how are we going to achieve this? And some of this comes down to privacy. How is this information going to be disseminated? What data are we going to capture? And who's a third party vendor that we're going to be working with that's going to either aggregate this data and leverage this data to, support the masses, or at the same time, are they not ensuring that their data is secure as well? So we also have to start looking at the product design piece to go actually to the contract of the vendor. What's in the stipulation of contracts and the statement of work to ensure that we're protecting the data of these third-party individuals who may not be even aware that their data is being used in areas that they may prefer not to. So privacy has really kicked off in many respects about the information that we have available to us and how do we safeguard that. So we even moved into how we classify our data. So we started at kind of a small incremental steps to the product design piece, but it really comes down to documentation initially for us is what do we have in front of us and what's that going to be done for, if that helps.
Yeah, that's interesting because, from a government perspective, the government likes, the standards and these, contracting tools and things, and they use the ability to do business with them as leverage for the companies, right? So you put stipulations on the funding, which does tend to work, at least for to the extent that if you demand a certain standard on a product, they have to prove that they've done that due diligence on the product. Now, we all know that it could be eyewash to an extent, or it could be taken seriously, but that's really probably the biggest tools that the government has. But Lindsay, to your point, you were talking about capturing students walking between classes and stuff. So at the end of the day, what's the ability of us to enforce these these tools that already exist in product design and ethical product design? Once the cat's out of the bag, it just seems like everybody's doing it. So who do you go after, and how do you punish them, or do you punish them?
I think, yeah, as I argued before, Doug, I think it's never too late, right? And for some folks, it's not really a choice, right? The technology, whatever it is harming their community so deeply that they have no choice but to think about, how can I resist? How can I push back? How can I agitate to get this to stop? And I think that's happening in a number of sectors, right? But certainly when we're talking about technologies that enhance people's capacities to do violence or do harm, right? Those are sites where we're seeing a lot of organized pushback on the ground. And I think the question of how do we transform these processes? You need to ask who gets to participate in what I'm building, right? What kinds of values, goals, or assumptions about the world am I baking into what I'm building? Am I listening to the people who could be most disparately harmed by what I'm building? So I think if those two things are happening, right, that level of self-reflection and democratization of who gets to participate in the design process, coupled with throwing our weight behind the folks who are already doing this organizing on the ground, I do think transformation is possible. And I think we've seen it happen. We've seen it happen in places like New York and California. We've seen it happen with Googlers walking out of their workplaces. So I'm actually optimistic, as opposed to feeling like technology's run amok and we're never going to catch up with it, right?
Yeah, I used to call myself a cyber optimist. So just because there's so much negative stuff out there.
Well, I think, Doug, too, computers have extended, into every part of our life. You think about the apparatus, the technology that's around us, be it phone, Siri, your car, your mobility, even elevators to that point. I think a lot of this too is based on kind of malign influences that, quite frankly, raises my concern about how people manipulate people's emotions, and they can use that digitally. They can use that with information or data that they may not know they have of that particular person. So it really kind of gets down to the assessment of that level of due diligence about what is your product intended to do. And I think just the fact that malign influences, cognitive security about, exacerbating people's emotions, whether it's politics or the election, or even for that matter, a product, is really one I think the government has to really have stronger interface with. And again, Lindsay speaks of this stuff so very well, but you think about the HIPAA laws that are in place to protect our data and our information, whether we're looking at a Bill of Rights to protect our data in the near future towards our privacy. But I think the government's really going to have to evolve itself in this discussion. And you see it in ebbs and flows, like I mentioned to you before with DOD. You know, they've got some guardrails, if you want to call it that, even of DARPA about AI. But I think it has to message itself. And so the question is how the state legislatures are going to handle that. And I think the UEGroup, you know, has some good processes in place. I think that could really help people think through their steps of how you are communicating externally and internally. But the whole malign influence piece in terms of how you leverage data and how you use that to manipulate and get people to do things that they may not otherwise do, as we're seeing today, is a deep concern for me.
Yeah, Bryan, on that, because you got to the party late here today, I'm going to put you on the spot again. So talk to me about malign influence campaigns, just a kind of a general definition, maybe a couple of examples, and then tell me about the just the type of work that you and your colleagues are doing to help people protect themselves from these campaigns, because I think what you're doing is fascinating in the psychological space, looking at this from the psychological implications. So if you could just briefly give us, you know, what is it, and what's you know, what's your approach to pushing back against it?
Sure. I think, you know, malign influence really is evoking strong emotion that leads people to share information without first asking or looking. And you see it in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. You see how the legislative cycle can warrant people to think that, hey, I'm focusing on this topic, but it's really about something else. So it's how you cast the narrative, quite frankly. And then you use that narrative to leverage news or coming from the media or even purporting facts to say, here's what this is, here's what's happening here. When quite frankly, when you start looking at critical thinking tools, you kind of, you know, more or less buffet that to say, is this really the information that's being presented to me in an accurate fashion? Is it coming from a third party, or is it coming from an adversary? And you're seeing that talked about quite a bit, quite frankly, with, you know, China or with Russia. And so what we're trying to distill is making sure we kind of get people to stop before they react with the information that's in front of them. Because if you're trying to invoke strong emotional reaction to a situation by misinterpreting facts, or again, focusing on the cognitive security of a situation, then that's really going to compel people to make decisions that probably are in the best interest of both for them or for the business. So for instance, if you look at cybersecurity, which is why we delve into malign influences to cybersecurity, is 70 to 80% of, you know, cyber instances could be alluded to the human behavior. And so therefore, what is it that we can do to better ensure that there are safeguards that help protect people thinking through their security? And that's addressing misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda.
Yeah, I love this group, you know, and this event today, because it really refocuses on the human at as the center, and tech as something that is here to make our life better, instead of, you know, tech's going to solve all of our problems. Kind of the Zuckerberg narrative, you know, AI will cure everything. So how do you think the mindset needs to shift during the design process, so that it considers, and I'm going to say it, Lindsay, the unintended consequences of that arise from innovation and product development?
For those in the audience, Doug keeps giggling about unintended consequences, because when we were all chatting last night, I had brought up how much that phrase can irk me from time to time. And I shared with Doug a piece that I'll recommend to everyone else by Nassim Parveen on the phrase unintended consequences. So I think my interest in that phrase is just when is something truly an unintended consequence versus when is someone just trying to abdicate responsibility, or when is it unintended because that person hasn't really been in dialogue with the communities who are going to be impacted, or they haven't engaged with scholarship outside of their own field to learn how to think more critically about something that they're building. So I guess those are my concern. That's my concern with the phrase unintended consequence. When do we start actually holding people accountable? When do we say there's just been too much discourse, there's too much scholarship, there's too many people out there saying that harm is being committed? How much longer can this go on before we say it's not so much an unintended consequence, it's that you're not listening, or it's not you're not doing the homework, right? Or that you're the system that you're participating in is fundamentally by design harming other people, and you have a responsibility to think critically about that and to engage in that. So I guess that's where my frustration comes from, which isn't to say that I think all designers are deliberately out there trying to harm people either, right? But I think maybe we need to just shift the discourse a little bit from unintended versus how are we designing our educational institutions or our workplaces to make it so that people are very siloed and not really in conversation with people that they're impacting.
Yeah, it's I mentioned this, as a prior military officer, we did so much training about what are the consequences of your actions. If you do this, then what happens? And we had what we called second and third order effects, where we were required to analyze, if I do this, then what happens at this level, what happens at the next level down. It seems like that consideration just doesn't take place. I don't believe that that the initial tech companies, the big tech companies that first really kind of took over the conversation these days, I don't believe that these are unintended consequences. I think maybe some of them are. I don't think maybe we knew that the speed at which misinformation and sensationalism would travel. But I do think that the creators of social media had to understand, the profound impact that both negative and positive, that putting that much access to information and making everybody a content creator could, how much impact it could have both from a positive and negative side. I think what they did is concentrate on the good news story, and because then it becomes a selling point, right? So nobody wants to talk about it, but it's very interesting that, we hold industries accountable. You can't buy a car without a seatbelt these days, but
and that's where that federal piece, state governance piece will be very critical, because for the next 7 years, we'll see more global tech change in the last 20 years combined. So we're really going to have to ramp up our efforts to kind of develop into the policies and the processes to ask these questions. And I think that you can see in certain respects too with onboarding new employees, what information are they receiving from, HR about the ethics of what they're doing, what contractual things are in place to make sure we're asking the right questions, misinformation, disinformation, making sure we have authentication in terms of cybersecurity to weed out the bad stuff and protect the good stuff. And so for me, I think one of the things is about building that trust up again. And I think a lot of it's, really focusing on our community partners and making sure we do a better job engaging our community leaders. An example of this is our county EMA, our county directors who do technology. Many of our counties throughout the United States are woefully underfunded and not very prepared. And it's not their fault. They're good people. They're trying very hard. But this is a very difficult time. So their audience, they have to really define the conversations to their audience to make sure that we really improve our cybersecurity hygiene. And I think that some of the technology is moving so quickly, it's so hard to keep up with things. And that's why I think there's a governance piece here that still is really critical as best as possible. And I can think of no better partner than our universities. Can you imagine conducting roadshows with our universities talking about the ethics of things? Can you have better socialization with chambers of commerce, to bring these things? We've got a lot of incredible uptick partners who are promoting and doing great things within the government, who are entrepreneurs or small business owners, female minority-owned businesses. And so the way we can kind of do a better job escalating some of this stuff, I believe, is using existing communication vehicles such as our counties and our states and the federal government. Can you imagine if, PTAC, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, who provide funding to uptick and get people contracts in the federal government, has a reminder about ethics and can leverage, groups like the UEGroup to say, hey, if you're looking at this particular audience, here are some of the steps you can go under. So I'm a big believer that we need to leverage everything we've got. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if we are, because I mean, this is a conversation for me, and listening to Lindsay is outstanding, because to me, it reminds myself of like, what do I need to be doing better to talk about the ethics of what we're doing and how we're doing things. So sorry for that diatribe.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. You talk about kind of the macro level there, but what about the concept of digital human rights? We've seen, one of the great things about social media is that connectivity at the individual level, and we've seen those groundswells, those social movements that have made the world a better place to a great extent, because people have demanded it. So, digital human rights is a concept. I think the UNHCR tried to do something with it, but I haven't. Outside of that, I've heard the term, but does it exist out there? Do we have digital? Are there groups advocating, individuals advocating for digital human rights?
Yeah, I think there certainly are groups, right? But I think human rights discourse is, of course, something that precedes the digital age, and there are many critiques of human rights discourse, right? In particular, the U.S. and other Western powers not necessarily being held accountable to these standards, and yet using them to get by, whether it's asymmetrical trade deals or other sites of ways that this could be used for foreign policy advantages, right? So I think for me, one thing that I've learned is anything that I think is like new about the digital age, whether it's a problem or it's a tool, I really want to kind of think historically about when we want to talk about digital human rights. Well, was human rights working for us? And if not, like, how can I think about those critiques when it comes to envisioning, is digital human rights really the path forward? If not, why not? If so, how might we need to reframe? What does it mean to have a human rights-based framework or international agreements that are actually where everyone is held accountable to them, right? And they can't be used for strategic purposes or for paternalism towards other countries. So I guess my thinking is still very much open on that, because I think this discourse is still kind of taking shape. But I am kind of weary of latching onto these kind of existing frameworks, putting the word digital in front of them, and hoping they might solve problems that are just baked in and super systemic and challenging.
Bryan, any thoughts on either digital human rights or universal values?
No, I love the way, Lindsay talked through that, because I think there's just a broader concept to, like, civility and ethics and morality. And I think that still needs to be kind of, the overarching thing, or whatever you put in front of it or behind it. And I don't know if you guys have mentioned, those dark platforms, but I think that's a really good example. And if you go back towards school safety and security, there's so much discussion about the physical security of schools, and having, run school safety programs per se doesn't make you an expert in everything. The biggest thing that comes up, you think about weapons, you think about the tragedies, you also have to be holistic to think about too the digital impact, the interface that these kids have with misinformation, disinformation, and the impact that has on parents. And of course, the legislature with, all of these motions running very hot, rightly so. But the ethical thing about how do we protect our kids both physically and online continues and should be a critical focus on our discussions in terms of ethics, and especially with ethics in schools, and making sure we're protecting individuals from misinformation and disinformation. So but I agree with what she says about the ethical aptitude and making sure we apply that holistically.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I watched a congressional testimony about deepfakes. And the congressional panel that was there, the average age was probably about 65. And as this technologist was describing, deepfakes and the fact that over 90% of the industries in pornography, the innovation has really arisen from that. The fact that for eight deepfake technologies that are created, there's only 2 technologies for deepfake detection that are created. But so he's giving all these facts, and he's talking about, you know, the potential impacts of somebody creating a deep fake of a president or a diplomat and causing an incident. And I remember this congressman just kind of leaning over the desk and saying, and I'm paraphrasing, if what you're saying is true, it's the most frightening thing I've ever heard in my life. So just kind
Well, and I
of,
think, Doug, I appreciate you bringing that up because there's a great company in Indiana that counters deepfake. And I know that, you know, the bilateral relationship that the United States has with Australia is really focusing on that piece, particularly with influences from different countries, you know, splicing videos and data and other things to kind of maybe change the narratives or the subject of an elected official of Australia. So these are really deep, concerning things. So I appreciate you bringing that specific topic up.
yeah, that's always been an area of research for me and fascination for sure. You know, those are products that are being used out there too. You can download these apps now to your phone, and the things you can create on your phone are almost indistinguishable to the human eye from reality. But kind of getting back on this, I guess I go back to the question, you know, are designers out there, are they doing this intentionally? Are they designing these dark patterns, and not just, you know, for purposes, for national security purposes or influence campaigns? But I'll give you a great example. I mean, try and unsubscribe from SiriusXM. You know, it's ridiculous. I mean, you have to go through like an 18-step process, and if you quit anytime in that process because you're frustrated, guess what? You're not unsubscribed. So we look at that as a dark pattern. You know, a technological product that has been designed to keep you subscribed and frustrates you to the point, or make it so confusing to somebody who maybe is intellectually impaired, or they're elderly, or whatever, cognitively impaired, that they can't unsubscribe for it. You know, so I think I asked the question, you know, in general, are designers intentionally designing with these dark patterns in mind?
I guess for me, I mean, I think of course there are going to be some who are, of course there are going to be some who are not, right? And I think dark patterns are of course incredibly problematic, but I think we also have to ask ourselves, what is it about the current configuration of industry that makes this possible? And is this really so far different from kind of everyday patterns of the attention economy in a context that rewards and incentivizes the commodification of user data, the targeting of advertising based on people's demographic traits or preferences, that sort of thing? So I guess, you know, I want to think critically and talk about what's so fraught about dark patterns, but I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that they're born out of and emerge from general day-to-day activities of industry that are not drastically or dramatically different when you're fundamentally prioritizing profits over questions of social good.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the fiscal incentives to do things quickly and to get the product out there is got to be steep, especially the competition amongst technology sectors to get the latest and greatest product out there. I mean, you've seen that in some respects too, about how news channels, whether it's Fox, CNN, or MSNBC, has to be very thoughtful about when they declare the president has won, you know, because they have to make sure that they're not the first to get out there, but they want to be the first to get out there. But how if the information is incorrect and that state didn't declare a winner? So I think that's a big thing, is what incentivize a lot of this is, of course, the fiscal, the business, and the speed of market, which I think, you know, many people recognize as a critically important, you know, need. But I think, Doug, too, the adversarial piece is one that you see, you know, quite a bit, and how they're leveraging that to kind of, you know, sway a population, specifically by a region, about here's what we have and here's what we're doing. So the adversarial piece really, again, is one that, you know, is very concerning.
Well, thanks for that. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but Bryan, I also want to give you the opportunity to. Lindsay and I already kind of answered this question about what can people do. You know, what do you want to leave folks with as as something they can, a tool that they can use to, from your perspective, to protect themselves or to educate themselves. Like I said, Lindsay and I already kind of threw some things out there. I want to afford you that opportunity also.
I'm probably not going to give you anything that's really life altering. I'm a big policy and process guy. So I think I always have to refer to what you have currently available to you in terms of what's, making informed decisions. What kind of statement of work or contracts do you have? What's in the contracts? What's in the statement, particularly protecting your data, your privacy, and that of your company and others. The other thing I look at is strenuously is basically the training that's available for employees, and make sure it's good training, it's not overbearing, that really asks the questions, particularly having an ethical piece that I think should be consistent, at least yearly, and making sure that there's some things in there to kind of help people, remind people, especially with the ability to work from home and having all these different subsets of data or information coming into either your work computer or your personal computer, but there's an interface there that sometimes we have to parse out, which makes it very complicated for your IT director. So it's really important that we give the IT directors the abilities to actually really help us, decide what's best for the company, give you guys the tools that you need to do your job. But we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that people can actually manipulate your technology fairly easily. So those are those kind of hard craft, hard skills that I would look at particularly, but also just making sure that onboarding is really succinct to those new employees coming in who have all these great ideas, who want to move the product. And I think the overarching element is just like, who you're doing business with is important too. Whether it's DoD or state, they have some protocols there, but those who don't have those things, you always have to kind of look at it for what it is.
Great, thank you for that, Bryan. We've got some great questions here, so I want to get through as many of them as we can. So a question from the audience: is it even possible to create ethical products in a capitalist system? Isn't this kind of the fundamental issue? The system which these products are being developed does not allow the bandwidth to do the due diligence necessary to not have unintended consequences, because it's not the main goal of the system.
I'd have to say that I mean, I agree implicitly. I think that Natasha is absolutely right. I also think we can add an imperialist context when we think about Cambridge Analytica, right? This was a company that was being used to conduct psyops for the US government in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So I think when it comes to our consciousness, because it's social media, suddenly there's all this exceptionalizing rhetoric and there's outrage, right? But these are practices that are kind of baked into a number of our institutions. And the question is, who really gets to decide, who are the malicious actors and who are the good actors, or what's misinformation and what's disinformation? And do we have democratic processes for that? Do we have marginalized people who have been systematically oppressed for generations and generations? Are they the ones that are really getting to be part of these decision-making contexts? And they're not, right? So I agree. I think any system that's designed to perpetuate harm, to exploit, to prioritize profit or geopolitical advantage over the common good, right? Those are systems that are going to make it extremely difficult to do the right thing and do the just thing. And I think that that's why some of the best responses and transformations are happening at the grassroots level, as opposed to top down.
Yeah, good point on that. And this next question kind of goes along with it also. Can that humane paradigm align with business goals? I know Randy had shown some ways to transform business, taking it from being financially incentivized to incentivizing to make life, make a better quality of life. Do you think it's possible to change the system to realign, from financials being our values to, humanity being our values?
I can't broadly answer that, maybe to the level that Lindsay can, but I would say that it really comes down to the individual, the entity, and the business. So, having a mission, vision, value statement is very critical. The community partnerships that you have, I've seen has really come a long way in terms of the civic mindedness of the employees of that particular group. For instance, some of the universities and colleges in Indiana are really out there promoting a lot of things that I think are very good and healthy in that regard. And I think it's really generated a lot of conversation with the state legislature. I think that if I can, preface this, I think it's important that we have the ability to influence policymakers as long as we engage them thoughtfully, creatively, and tactfully. I would say that most of my experiences working with, the federal government or the state government is these state reps, these federal officials, they're there for a reason. We voted them in or not, but the point is that they're there now. Let's work with them. Let's leverage them. Let's sit down and talk to their aides, their chief of staff, their legislative director. We got to engage the legislature and the state as best we possibly can, wherever you may be, because they can really influence things and be educated about things. And there's there's so much going on in their lives right now, like in ours. But I think that we can aim a lot to really influence and support and focus on the legislatures and our policymakers, because I think that they're out there, and I think that we could engage them more, quite frankly.
Thank you for that, Bryan. So I think that about wraps it up. Again, I want to thank my panelists, Dr. Lindsay Weinberg and former Director of Homeland Security, Bryan Langley. So thank you very much for contributing to this conversation and help promoting these issues and solutions. And of course, the UEGroup for hosting this event, Randy for his leadership in the Center for Humane Technology, and of course, our amazing folks in the background who, without them, we could not do any of this. So Danielle and Lindsay, both of you, thank you for your help in that. Tony, thanks also. So I'll turn it back over to you, Danielle.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I just want to give a last thank you to today's participants, both all three of you, and also Randy and Tony, who delivered the opening remarks in our keynote speech, and for everybody who tuned in today. We are going to send out a survey link right now out in the chat. We'd love to hear feedback just on how you guys would like to continue the conversation around this topic and any feedback on the event today. I'm also going to do a little plug for X Center, another thanks for joining. And if you'd like to stay connected, we regularly host events, and there's a lot going on down at Purdue University that we'd love to keep you informed on. So this is some contact information, and just gonna leave this little QR code on here. So if you have your phone handy, you can just scan the QR code and take the survey directly there. But I'll leave this up, and thank you so much again, everybody, for your time today. I think it was really valuable and some great discussion happened. So the recording will be sent out after this. We're going to upload it to YouTube and a few other places. So we'll send a copy of that and everybody's contact information as well. So thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, everyone.